She had a 7-foot wingspan and a jumper that could break defenses in half, and the team that drafted the most electric point guard in a generation just let her walk for nothing. Sit with that for 1 second before you keep reading, because what Indiana just did isn't a footnote. It's a confession about who they actually are as a franchise, and once you understand every layer of this decision, you're going to understand exactly why so many people around this league are furious right now. Here's the story nobody in that front office wants to tell you straight. On January 14th, 2025, the Las Vegas Aces filed an offer sheet for Justyne Pissou, a player who had spent the entire season sitting quietly on Indiana's developmental roster. The Fever had one job: 24 hours to make one phone call and promote her to a standard contract. That's the whole ask. No trade, no draft capital, no complicated negotiation, no cap gymnastics. Just a signature on a piece of paper. And they said no. They looked at a 6 feet 4 inches shooter with a 7-foot wingspan, a player built in a lab to complement Caitlyn Clark, and they chose instead to protect a roster spot for Damiris Dantas, a 32-year-old backup center who averaged 3 points and 1 rebound a game in the playoffs the year before. That's not a basketball decision. That's an organization telling you exactly where its priorities sit, and it isn't with winning. Let that timeline breathe for a second, because the details make it worse the longer you sit with them. Pissou wasn't some unproven mystery box that the front office had reason to be cautious about. In her one preseason appearance against the New York Liberty, she played 3 minutes and scored 10 points, pulling up from 25 feet and moving without the ball like she'd been doing it her whole career. 3 minutes, 10 points. That's not a fluke. That's a flare going up in the sky, visible from space. And Indiana's response to seeing that flare wasn't to build on it, wasn't to get curious, wasn't to say let's see more. It was to bury her. She never played another preseason minute after that game. Not garbage time, not a single possession. The reporting since has suggested the Fever were deliberately keeping her hidden, trying to stash her on a cheap developmental deal without other teams noticing what they had. Think about how backwards that is as a strategy. Instead of using the preseason to raise her value, evaluate her fit next to their franchise player, or build leverage for a future trade, they tried to make her invisible on purpose. And it still didn't work, because the Aces do their homework, found her anyway, and swooped in the moment they got the chance to file that offer sheet. Now here's where this becomes impossible to separate from the Caitlyn Clark conversation, because everything about this decision loops directly back to her. Clark is already one of the most gifted passers women's basketball has ever produced. She threads passes through traffic and transition, finds shooters in the corner off a live dribble, hits cutters without even turning her head their way. But none of that changes a single game if the space isn't there for her to actually operate in. Watch any Fever broadcast from last season, and you'll see the same pattern play out possession after possession. Defenses collapse on her without any fear of consequences, because they know the shooters standing around the arc aren't real threats yet. Clark ends up trying to create offense in a phone booth against triple teams while her teammates stand around the perimeter as decoration instead of weapons. That is not a Caitlyn Clark problem. She didn't ask to be doubled and tripled every time she touches the paint. That is a roster construction problem, plain and simple, and roster construction was never her job to solve. It was the front office's job, and the answer to it was sitting right there on their own bench, making $700 a week while they hid her from the league. A shooter like Pissou changes the math instantly the moment she steps on the floor. When a defender has to respect a 6 feet 4 inches wing who can pull from 25 feet without hesitation, that defender cannot afford to sag off and help in the paint anymore. The instant that happens, driving lanes open up that simply weren't available before, and a passer with Clark's vision finds those gaps in a heartbeat. This is not some advanced analytics secret. It's basic modern basketball logic that every competitive front office in this league understands. The most valuable role players in today's game are the ones who make your star better without ever needing the ball in their own hands, because they force impossible choices on the defense, help off them, and give up a wide-open three. Stay attached to them and hand over the driving lane. Pissou was built for exactly that role, physically and skillfully. Indiana had her under a cheap, team-friendly contract and let her walk straight into the arms of the two-time defending champions instead of paying her a fraction of what she was worth. So let's actually look at what they chose to keep instead of her, because the Dantas argument deserves zero softening, zero benefit of the doubt. Yes, she's been in the league since 2012. Yes, if you buy into the idea that veteran presence brings some intangible locker room value that doesn't show up in a box score, you could squint hard enough to understand the instinct behind it. Except the results simply do not back that theory up in any honest reading. In the playoffs, 3 points a game, 1 rebound a game, and the Fever were swept in the first round without much resistance. Whatever leadership she was supposedly providing behind the scenes never once translated into an actual win on the floor. And she wasn't even logging real, meaningful minutes to begin with. She was appearing in garbage time stretches and foul trouble substitutions, the kinds of moments that almost never swing an outcome either way. Choosing that profile of player over a young, ascending talent with clear, obvious WNBA-level tools isn't wisdom. It isn't savvy roster management. It's an organization that values comfort and familiarity over the harder, more uncomfortable work of actually building something that can compete for a title. Dantas at 32 is not getting better next season. Pissou was only getting started on her development curve. Indiana chose the safe, known floor over the unproven ceiling, and then dressed the whole thing up publicly as a plan. And here's the part that should worry Fever fans even more than the Pissou decision itself. This is not an isolated misstep from an otherwise sharp front office. This is a pattern, and once you start looking for it, you see it everywhere. Look back at how this organization has handled personnel decisions over the past several years, and a very consistent shape starts to emerge. There's been questionable handling of situations involving established players like Kelsey Mitchell, coaching hires that have drawn constant public scrutiny and second-guessing from people around the league, a draft strategy that hasn't always matched the timeline of the generational talent they're supposedly building around. A development philosophy that, if the Pissou situation is any indication, seems to actively avoid developing anyone at all. And when you're the franchise that drafted the single most culturally significant player in the history of this sport, a player who has single-handedly moved television ratings and ticket prices and merchandise sales, the cost of that organizational dysfunction isn't small. It's enormous, and it compounds every single season it goes unaddressed. General Manager Amber Cox hasn't had to answer hard, direct questions about any of this in public settings. The press conferences stay carefully, deliberately safe, wrapped in the same soft organizational language every time. Trust the process. Believe in the vision. Appreciate what our veterans bring to this locker room. But what exactly is the vision here, when the actual, measurable results are a first-round sweep? A perfect complimentary piece handed over to the defending champions for absolutely nothing in return, and a 32-year-old bench player protected over a rising talent who was producing at a higher rate in 3 minutes than some rotation players manage in 20. If that's the process is fundamentally broken, and at some point that has to be said plainly instead of buried under press conference platitudes. Fans deserve a coherent explanation, not a mood board of comforting phrases. Now put yourself in Caitlyn Clark's shoes for a second, because eventually every conversation about this franchise has to go there. She just completed one of the most remarkable rookie seasons this league has ever seen, dragging an undermanned, poorly spaced roster into national relevance through pure individual brilliance, turning Fever games into appointment viewing on a nightly basis across the entire sport. She showed up, she competed at an elite level, she elevated the profile and revenue of an entire organization almost single-handedly. She did everything humanly possible to earn real, serious investment from the people running this franchise. And their major offseason response to that effort was to let a perfect complementary piece walk away for free so they could keep a bench center averaging 3 points a game in the postseason. If you're Clark watching that unfold in real time, what conclusion do you start to quietly draw about the people around you? How do you not start wondering whether this front office is genuinely committed to building a winner, or whether they're simply riding your talent while they figure things out on the fly, season after season, with no real urgency? These are exactly the kinds of doubts that, left unaddressed long enough, eventually turn into a superstar deciding that loyalty to an organization only runs in one direction for so long before she starts asking questions about her future somewhere else. Meanwhile, look at exactly where Pissou landed, because the contrast could not be more stark or more instructive. Las Vegas. Back-to-back defending champions. Aya Wilson in the building every single day as a living, breathing example of what elite professional standards actually look like up close. A coaching staff and front office that clearly, demonstrably know how to identify and develop talent, proven by the simple fact that they found her while Indiana was actively trying to hide her from the rest of the league. She goes from $700 a week to $150,000 for the remainder of the season. She goes from 3 token preseason minutes to real, meaningful rotation minutes on a championship-caliber roster. She goes from an organization that looked right past her value to one that moved decisively the very moment they spotted an opening. In a couple of years, when she's a legitimate rotation piece contributing to another Aces title run, Fever fans are going to remember exactly what happened in January 2025 with painful clarity, and it's going to sting in a very specific way, because every single part of it was completely preventable. Indiana had genuine options at every single stage of this process, and they whiffed on all of them. They could have promoted her mid-season the moment she flashed that kind of upside. They could have used her in the rotation, even in small doses, to build her trade value and properly test her fit alongside Clark before making a final call. They could have simply matched the offer sheet when Las Vegas came calling, which was, by a wide margin, the cheapest, easiest, most obvious move available to them. At every single decision point along the way, this front office made the wrong call, and not by a narrow margin either. And the hardest part for Fever fans to sit with here isn't just that they lost a talented young player to a division rival. It's what that loss reveals about the actual philosophy running the entire organization from the top down. There is a real, meaningful difference between building a roster specifically designed to maximize a generational talent and simply having that talent on your roster while hoping she carries the whole operation on her own back. The first path requires genuinely uncomfortable decisions. Letting go of familiar veterans when the numbers say it's time. Prioritizing fit and long-term upside over short-term comfort. Having an actual, coherent strategic vision that you can explain out loud with a straight face. The second path just requires drafting her first overall and quietly standing back to watch what happens. Everything about how this specific situation was handled suggests Indiana is currently running that second playbook while insisting publicly, in every press conference, that they're actually running the first. A franchise that was genuinely serious about building around Caitlyn Clark would have looked at Justyne Pissou months ago and seen exactly what she was. A cheap, ascending asset with the precise physical tools and skill set to make their best player significantly more dangerous on the floor. And they would have protected that asset without a second of hesitation. They would have given her real run in games that mattered, built her steadily into the rotation, made her an explicit part of the long-term plan around their franchise cornerstone. Instead, they hit her in the preseason, ignored her for the entire regular season, and then watched her walk straight out the door to the 2-time defending champions without lifting a single finger to stop it from happening. That is not bad luck. That is not some complicated salary cap situation forced on them by circumstances outside their control. That is a deliberate, clear-eyed, fully conscious choice made by real people in that building, and it tells you everything you need to know about what kind of organization the Indiana Fever currently are, whether they're willing to admit it publicly or not. They had something genuinely rare in their hands. A young, cheap, motivated player who could space the floor at real size, defend with legitimate length on the wing, and elevate a generational passer without ever needing the ball in her own hands to make an impact. All it took to keep her was one straightforward decision, made within a 24-hour window, with no real cost attached to it. They couldn't do it. They chose 3 points and 1 rebound a game from a 32-year-old over the ceiling of a player who could have been a genuine cornerstone piece for years to come. Las Vegas is a better basketball team today specifically because Indiana failed here. Caitlyn Clark is stuck fighting through the exact same spacing and roster problems she's been dealing with since the day she was drafted. And Justyne Pissou finally gets the real, legitimate shot she always deserved from the beginning. Just not from the franchise that honestly should have given it to her first, given every dollar and every ounce of goodwill she generated for them in the process. If you're a Fever fan reading this should make you genuinely, sustainably angry. Not the kind of anger that flares up for a day and fades once the news cycle moves on, but the sustained, clear-eyed kind that demands real, specific accountability from the people making these decisions on your behalf. Because this was never a complicated situation with reasonable, defensible arguments sitting on both sides of the table. It was a 6 feet 4 inches shooter with a 7-foot wingspan walking straight out the door to a division rival, so a 32-year-old averaging 3 points a game in the playoffs could keep her seat warm on the bench. Indiana made that choice with their eyes wide open, fully aware of what they were giving up and who they were handing it to. And until something fundamentally changes inside that front office, in how they evaluate talent, in how they communicate with their fans, and how seriously they actually take the responsibility of building around a generational star, there's no real reason to believe the next big decision they make is going to look any different from this one.